All right, Madam President, last year, the Federal Communications Commission approved an application by Legato Networks to repurpose federal spectrum in a way that will drastically interfere with GPS and satellite communications. This is a big deal. There are so many people who understand this situation. There's a list of companies behind us that grows every day. Almost every company in America that you know of or have heard of, his name is on this list. The decision that was made will threaten GPS and satellite communications reliability for millions of Americans who depend on it. The reliability of GPS and satellite communications is necessary for safety of life, and operations, national security, and economic activity. And I'm going to pause here for a minute to drive home what this actually means for every American, because people don't know this. They don't know how important GPS is. And yet there's not an American I can think of by description who isn't using it every day. So if something happens to it, there's a serious problems. Here are some of the day-to-day activities that would be difficult when experiencing GPS interference from Legato. A big one, using your credit card or your debit card when you are making a purchase or using an ATM. Our financial systems rely on GPS timing in order to work. Another one, making a phone call. Cell phone networks rely on GPS synchronized cell towers, so calls can be passed seamlessly. If they experience interference, you could be dropped when moving from one tower to another. Another one of the most that people are not aware of and don't expect is energy. Whether that is filling up your tank with gas at the pump, or electrical grids to light our homes. We rely on GPS timing to safely operate underground pipelines and our electricity grid. Farmers and ranchers, and that's something a lot of people are not aware of, but they depend on GPS in satellite communications when planting crops, applying fertilizer, and during harvest operation to move large and critical machinery with precision. Working out, a lot of people don't. I don't do as much as I used to do, but a lot of people, they say that 1/5 of the population, 20% of the population of all Americans use fitness tracker or smartwatch, or the majority of use GPS to count steps and when they track a distance. We all know that. We see them out there every day. They're all using it, and they depend on what? They depend on GPS. Taking a flight. I had occasion, I've been involved in aviation for over 70 years now, and had occasion with 3 friends to fly around the world in 1991 using GPS. And at that time, it may be the first, the equipment that I used was a Trimble TNL 2000. Trimble is one of the big GPS companies. I was using one, TNL 2000. At that time, that may have been, we're checking to see, the first time that that's been used for private aviation flying all the way around the world. Again, that's GPS, and that was 1991. Driving around right now, each day, countless Americans rely on Google Maps, Waze, Apple Maps, and any other navigation system to get them from point A to point B. And while no one hopes to ever need a fire truck or ambulance, or the 911 operators, the EMS, GPS, they use GPS on a daily basis. So there's more. Weather forecasting, the movement of goods on our highways, surveying maritime harbors, channels, and everything else. The list goes on and on. Now, how do we know that Legato will cause interference? The FCC told us when they approved the Legato order, and I will read that now because I think people need to understand. I guess you'd say we were warned. The FCC said in their document, that was the document they used on their approval order, They said, quote, "Legato shall expeditiously repair or replace as needed any U.S. government GPS devices that experience or are likely to experience harmful interference from Legato's operations," unquote. That's a quote. That's what they said. That's what the FCC said at that time. Over 21 organizations and companies and industries have filed petitions for reconsideration after the order was released, documenting the damage that they'd face from the Legato interference. This thing right out behind me is now up to 82. It was 78 this morning, and the list goes on and on. You can hardly think of a corporation in America that isn't on this list. And so it's something that is a very serious problem and widespread. There's one way to put the interference into perspective. Because GPS signals travel from satellite in space, by the time those signals get to Earth's surface, they're low power. Because the FCC order allows Legato to repurpose spectrum to operate a terrestrial-based network, Legato signals on Earth's surface will be much more powerful than GPS, causing substantial and harmful interference. And while the FCC required Legato to repair damage to federal agencies that result from the interference, congressional action is needed because the FCC's Legato order fell short in two important ways. First, the order did not provide an adequate description of costs to the federal agencies that would result from Legato's interference. We took bipartisan steps to correct this last year in the NDAA. The NDAA is the largest bill of the year. I happen to have been, for several years, the chairman of this thing. And the NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Bill. It does all the things that we do in the military. And so that's the bill that we're talking about. So we included in that bill a provision directing the Department of Defense to produce an estimate of damages and costs associated with the harmful interference to GPS. We also directed DOD, Department of Defense, and the National Academies of Science to conduct an independent technical review of the harmful interference that Legato could cause. Secondly, the FCC failed to require that Legato bear the cost of interference to state government or pay for interference to devices owned by individual users. Now, we're talking about all Americans out there now, not just government, not state government, not federal government, but everyone else. These are individual users. And I talked already about how many ways we rely on GPS in everyday life. None of that would be protected from interference under the existing Legato order. And that's why I'm introducing legislation. It's a long name, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's called the Recognizing and Ensuring Taxpayer Access to Infrastructure Necessary for GPS and Satellite Communications Act of 2021. Got that? All right. Well, I call it the Retain Act. It's a little more accurate and easy to understand. Now, my legislation ensures federal agencies, state governments, and all other negatively impacted by the actions of a private actor are not left holding the bag when it comes to costs, the amount of money that it would cost to rectify it. And worse, aren't put in a position where they have to push the costs onto the American consumers. Now, why is this legislation necessary? The reliable GPS and satellite communication is important to everyone in the world and drives much of the nation's economy. Now, that's why I'm saying I'm going to ask my colleagues to embrace, endorse, and co-sponsor this legislation. I mean, otherwise, others may be forced to pay for damage that is done by the system. So anyway, we're going to ask our colleagues to join me in co-sponsoring this legislation. If we don't do this and something happens, then it will be paid for by not those responsible parties, but by the taxpayers. With that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.